Шановні друзі, ми раді вітати цього вечора вас всіх на традиційній зустрічі дискусійного клубу «Відкрий, світ», який організовується фондом Арсенії Яценюка «Відкрий Україну» і представництвом німецького фонду імені Фрідріха Еберта в Україні. І цього разу у нас дуже цікавий гість, який має дуже багато років досвіду як політик німецький. Він дуже багато років працював в німецькому Бундестазі, був депутатом. Він був президентом Парламентської Асамблеї НАТО і також дуже цікаво, оскільки ми попередньо спілкувалися з ним, брав участь у різних переговорах зовнішньополітичних під час об'єднання Німеччини, під час коли руху НАТО на схід. І я думаю, він дуже багато цікавих речей може нам сказати, особливо щодо російських спекуляцій. Оце про те, що обіцяло НАТО Росії, коли воно дозволяло об'єднання Німеччини, а що не обіцяло. And traditionally we conduct our event in English, so I'm coming to English. I try to introduce you a little bit, that you were President of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO and many years MP at German Bundestag, and also have very huge experience in consulting government and dealing with international security and international issues. And you can share a lot of experience about period of German reunification, what was promised to Russia by NATO during the enlargement, and so on, so on. And I believe today we will have interesting discussion. Our guest will have some time for introductory speech. And after that, we welcome our audience to give questions, to comments to what is said. And we ask you to be active and to ask about what you really care about. So wish you all have a nice time. And please also mind that during the questions there will be our colleague with microphone. And you have to raise your hands. And it's better when you name yourself and name your position and organization for our guests to know about the audience more. So, Mr. Karstеном Фогтом, I'm pleased to introduce you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was asked to be relatively short with the introduction so that we have more time for the question and answer period. Ukraine is an old people with an old culture, but it has had relatively short periods of statehood. So one could also, if one looks at this development here, see a lot of this what is going on in Ukraine and around Ukraine as a state-building process. State-building processes have very often in history in Europe been connected with internal turmoil and conflict. And in these conflicts, very often, big powers have interfered. In the situation in which we are here, in this region, these big powers were primarily the Tsarist Empire, or the Soviet Union, the Ottoman Empire, and the Habsburg Empire to the west. If one goes further west, the French and the Germans, and sometimes the British, have also been participating in these big power concept. And when you look at many of the peace-building conferences after major conflicts, or at the end of major conflicts, in the last 200, 300 years, we very often had the situation that the big powers of Europe at that time decided about boundaries, and that they decided about even the political dominance of conservative or progressive forces which were allowed in their sphere of influence. This was true at the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic War. This was true at the Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century. This was true in the post-war negotiations after World War I in Versailles and around Versailles. And it was true at the Conference of Yalta. When I understand the Russian politicians of today correctly, then they want a revival of this concept of big powers, where bigger nations guarantee and respect specific spheres of influence, and where bigger powers decide about the realities on the ground. I, in one meeting, asked a relatively famous Russian about this, and he said, Carsten, we want a new Yalta. This time not about you, but with you, and the French, and the Americans. And I asked him, what is about the other nations? The smaller nations. He answered me, they have anyhow too much to say. This is a concept which is in contradiction to the Charter of Paris, which was adopted in 1990. In 1990 in Paris, one adopted a concept in which one was striving for the rule of law. Soviet Union signed it. And one was striving for democracy, striving because it was not fully implemented yet. That which was already written down in the Helsinki Final Act, that if boundaries were changed only as a result of peaceful negotiation, not by military force. And then what was also new in the Charter of Paris was that each nation could decide about whether they want to become part of an international organization or not, meaning NATO or the European Union. At that time, signed by Russia. For us Germans, this Charter of Paris was, so to say, in philosophical terms, in legal terms, diplomatic terms, describing the end of the East-West conflict, which started with the fall of the wall early on in Poland. So it was a longer process with Gorbachev policies, but it was, so to say, formally expressed in the Charter of Paris. And we thought that if one would not, but if one tried to overcome the old risks and divisions in Europe, which we have seen for centuries, then one should stick to this new, historically seen new concept of the Charter of Paris, which started with the Charter of Helsinki, but then was concluded in the Charter of Paris. And because it managed the question of boundaries, and it defined the rights of smaller and bigger nations. And this relationship between smaller and bigger nations is a very serious one. Because of history, because smaller nations very often suffered from the policy of the bigger nations, but also because the management of the relationship between smaller and bigger nations is one of the core elements of the European Union. Because in the European Union, you have Germany, you have France, but you also have Luxembourg. And when you look at the realities, which makes the European Union a very complicated animal, but one of the reasons why it's continuing is that we have found, not a perfect, but a balance between the rights of smaller and bigger nations. When you look at the gross national product and the numbers of people which live in different states, then the bigger nations should dominate. But when you look at the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, each country has only one vote. When you look at the European Parliament, the bigger countries have more members than the smaller one, but the bigger should have many more members, and the smaller should have fewer members if one should define it in proportion to the number of inhabitants. The same is true in the European Council, where you have voting patterns which are complicated, but which guarantees that the bigger countries, even Germany and France together, cannot impose their will in a vote. And in the European Commission, each country is sending one representative. So in relative terms, one of the core elements of the cohesion of the European Union is that the bigger countries respect the interest, not only by saying it, but in procedure terms, for the smaller nations. So if this principle of management between smaller and bigger nations is attacked, we, living inside the European Union, would see it as an unraveling of the principles on which the European Union is based. And when we look at the larger picture of Europe, we see it as an element which is unraveling the relative stability which we have had after 1990. Therefore, this might not be the case to the same degree for some Americans and some French, but from the German point of view, to keep these principles of the Charter of the Paris is, so to say, it guarantees that not from outside, the old principles of the role of big powers versus small powers is repeated again, with all the instability which is concerned, because you never should forget that very often wars in Europe were fought about the territory of smaller nations, when then in Yugoslavia and in Poland and so on, where then other countries interfered. And we had, for example, also during the process of German unification, the British and the French went to Moscow and met with Gorbachev to slow down the process of German unification. So we said, yes, we respect that bigger powers in real political terms have more powers than smaller countries, but smaller and bigger countries have equal right, and there must be a balance of interest. Some of my American friends said to me, Carsten, you should learn to lead Europe. And you have a neurosis because of your past. And I said to him, if we would lead Europe in the same way as you sometimes are leading, we would be surrounded by hostile and suspicious countries again. And Germany was, after World War II, for understandable reasons, surrounded by hostile and suspicious countries. And one core element why this changed was that we didn't try to dominate our neighbors, that we tried to take their interest into consideration. Some Americans said we always ask all our neighbors before we make our own views clear. This is not quite so. But it's quite clear that Germany defines it as being its national interest to respect the interest of smaller powers, because this is an element by which we created a friendly environment. It's for the first time since centuries that Germany is surrounded by countries who are friends, want to become friends, or at least give the impression as if they're friends. This is, in terms of territory, the smallest united Germany which ever existed, but it's the best geostrategic situation in which we ever have been since several centuries. So to stick to that principles, that you, as a bigger power, which we now are again, have to respect the interests of the smaller powers, is more in our blood as an instinct than it is even in Britain and France. And we fear that Trump, who is saying Russia, United States first, USA first, is undermining these principles. So it's not only undermined by your eastern neighbors, but also by some statements coming from Trump. Therefore, this offer of a new concept of powers will not be accepted by Germany. And therefore, we will not accept a policy where, for example, France, Germany, and Russia, without Ukraine, are deciding about something about Ukraine and its boundaries, its society, its constitution, or so on. These countries have to be present. This is what we, as a core principle, have defended in the last years, and with some success. So it's not only neurotic, it's our definition of our national interest. Our definition of national interest says we have a broader definition of national interest, meaning it's in our interest to have a stable, prosperous, and democratic environment, and we only can have a stable, prosperous, and democratic environment if we contribute to it and if we take those countries and their interests into consideration. The British, by the way, have a narrow definition now of their national interests. This is one of the core reasons why they made the Brexit. And the Russians now have also a very narrow definition of the core interest. Their narrow definition of core interest doesn't mean that they want to have only a narrow environment of influence. It's a narrow definition of of national interest with perspective of becoming stronger than before. They want to revise their influence. They want to become stronger than they have been in the last years. And these many people in Ukraine, but also in Russia, have not understood this core element of our foreign policy. Second, beyond that, I would, and then I come very soon to my end, it's an element of political culture, which you develop. It can change over time in a positive or a negative direction. In the United States, justice has changed in a negative direction, this polarization. In Germany, it's an element of political culture that when somebody is nasty, it doesn't mean that you don't speak to him. So when Iran had the new mullahs there in government, the Americans no longer had an embassy there. We had an embassy there. We have an embassy in North Korea. We were speaking to the GDR. We were speaking to the Soviet leadership. And we are speaking to Egypt. We are speaking to Erdogan. In the US, to cooperate means reward. We are good, the other is bad. So we need to cooperate. If we cooperate with you, we give a signal in your direction that you are moving in the direction of becoming good. For us, we say most of the people with whom we need to negotiate are problem makers, troublemakers. And if we only would deal with the nice guys, we would have limited diplomatic contacts. So especially you need to talk to the nasty people. When Kaczynski who was not quite clear whether he hated the Germans more or the Russians more in Poland, he made a negative speech about Germany. We overheard it. Then he made a second negative speech. We overheard it. Then he made a third speech. Angela Merkel invited him to Berlin. So it's a different type of political style. Prestige does not matter very much. This is very important. For some nations, prestige play a big role. For post-war Germans, not so much. And therefore, we speak with countries, and very often when we speak with countries and negotiate with them, it's very often seen by people here, because you have a different political culture, as being soft. And if somebody makes a nasty speech and says, if that and that happens, we would attack you, or something, we say, what do you really mean? So we talk and exploit it and talk with those people. And this style to engage people, which is not always successful, and if it fails, we try it again, it's very often perceived as, in this region, as being soft, because you have politicians deal in a different way with one another. If people would cry in Germany as politicians in such a way, or being so impolite to one another, as they sometimes are in the Verkhovna Rada, in Germany they would be outcast. It's a simply different style. So when you analyze German politics, you have to take this into consideration, these factors which I described. What does it mean? And that's the end. We naturally want a Europe which is defined by the principle of cooperation and integration. Integration as much as possible, cooperation where integration is not possible. Russia does not want to be integrated into the European Union because it means to pool national sovereignty on a European level where you do not only decide alone. For the similar reasons, the United States would never join the European Union and give up sovereignty. So everybody, by giving up sovereignty, by pooling it on European level, loses something but gains weight in the European context. So if somebody wants to join, and if it's fine, if they are ready, they could. Before they are ready, they cannot. And this is a principle on which the European Union is based. But so we have an element of cooperation and integration. That's our ideal. For the time, if boundaries are changed by force, we are again in a different phase. We need a mixture of cooperation where possible and useful, and risk avoidance and defense when necessary. We are again in a new phase. I would have preferred the latter. We were in a better situation 10 years ago. I will never give up that we come to such a European peace order. But if you take the principles of Medvedev's proposal about the European peace order serious, collective security instead of collective defense, then in the case of Ukraine, once Ukraine was attacked, which it practically was, all the other nations which have signed this European treaty should have helped Ukraine. This is the principle of collective security. Obviously, this didn't happen. That's not because I'm ideologue, but because of the realities of Europe of today. Collective security has suffered, and collective defense has become more important. So cooperative security is possible in addition to collective defense, arms control and others. But I would not give up NATO because we need, as an insurance policy, collective defense. If we, beyond that, can get cooperative security, it would be fine. But we cannot rely with our security policy totally on that. So we are now in a strange situation that the German left, I'm a social democrat, is defending NATO against an American right-winger. Sometimes these situations are more complicated than one would have envisaged it. So I will stop here, and I'm simply saying that I still think that the most important point to stabilize Ukraine and its nation-building process, state-building process, is to have a stable domestic situation, economically, politically, and in terms of political culture. I think the military component is there. I don't forget that. But if Ukraine is stabilized and it's slowly growing again in its economy, then it's also becoming attractive again. And I think many issues and debates about national identity, about statehood, would disappear if there would be a prosperous Ukraine. So I think there is a military component, but as an outsider, I would say the domestic reform elements are in the longer run as important, if not more important, than these military security issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fogt. And now is the time for questions, comments from audience. So if you have any, please raise your hands. Here.
Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, guten Abend, Herr Voigt. I am ambassador retired of Ukraine. I spent 41 years on diplomatic service of Ukraine. From 1960 until 1963, I served in Soviet army on the territory of the state which does not exist, German Democratic Republic. So I knew something about the situation in this country, but many, many years ago, about 50, 53, 56 years ago. And now, as you say, we are living in a very complicated world. Interconnected, interdependent, and with the obvious behavior of one nuclear state, permanent member of Security Council, Russia, unpredictable behavior. And some days ago, President of Russian Federation, Putin said that Russia's borders never end. From my point of view, these words say that at least in the nearest future, we are not able to wait the change in the foreign policy of Russian Federation. So we need to meet the new troubles from this state. And in this situation, Ukraine is a very difficult position because as we see that Norman framework of the negotiations and also the negotiation in Minsk, they will not, at least for today, they not end it with any sign of positive result. How can you explain what, from your point of view, very experienced people, what will be the nearest future in Ukraine and in the relationship between Ukraine and Germany, which is a very important player on international arena, including the European stage. Thank you.
The situation will stay to be complicated, and when the referendum in Italy goes in the wrong direction next week, and a couple of elections go in a different direction, it will become more complicated even. So I have no optimistic vision in that sense. But now let me try to answer in a different way. This sounds cynical, what I'm saying now. But I'm not cynical, I'm suffering from the reality. It's an element of... But when you now look at, Putin is describing his policy there as a success in terms of Ukraine. What did they get? They control now Crimea, which they actually controlled before. They have preserved the right for a basis which nobody in Ukraine challenged at that time. They have control over parts of eastern Ukraine, which is like Ruhr with old industry, which is not competitive on the international markets. It costs them money. With the control over these two elements, the likelihood that they still have a majority of pro-Russian parties in the Verkhovna Rada is limited, because it was always a balance, but without Crimea and eastern Ukraine, these elements, it's difficult to get a majority. The way in which they attack, the Ukrainians have no negative sentiments in principle against Russians. There are many people who have positive sentiments about it. But the positive sentiments don't grow if you attack a country. So many people who were uncertain about their identity, even if they are Russian speaking, I've met a lot of them, consider them nowadays more than before as Ukrainians. So, cynically said, they speed up the nation-building process and statehood-building process in Ukraine, and they gained some territories for the time being and lost Ukraine. If that is success, I don't know what the failure is. And when you look at the economic situation, they start this conflict when they had high reserves, monetary reserves, and when the oil price was relatively high. The oil price will, in the longer run, not grow very much. Might be there go down because of fracking, because of alternative energies, and so on and so on. And the pipeline connections of Ukraine are growing. I leave Nord Stream 2 aside, but there are more and more, you have alternatives of supplies coming from the West. So your trade is rebalancing. You have more and more trade with EU countries compared with Russian clients. It takes time, it costs us, it's something. But altogether, I think that when you look at it not from the emotional side, where do the Russians get modernization from? From the Chinese? The Chinese get it from Germany. We offered them modernization partnership. They are now building up their economy more and more as a closed shop again, decoupling from others. So the prospect of Russia, which has a gross national product of that of Spain, and to play a world power with a gross national product of Spain is something tempting. It's a very big task. So I think on short-term military force, and this is a complicating factor, on short-term or military force side of the Russians, they have an advantage. On the longer run, to base their desire of playing a world role on such a policy cannot succeed. And the problem is that we have two timelines. The military is working on short notice. The economy is working on long notice. And this is also true. You have the Eastern conflict and you have the domestic stabilization. So we have two different types of conflict. It's the process of stabilizing this region with support from the West, from Germany, and for stabilizing the economy and the democracy and the rule of law in Ukraine. And the short-term destabilization elements coming, as you rightly are saying, from the Russian side by military and also by economic sanction from their side against Ukraine. And for us, it is a task to neutralize the negative effect on the short term of the military and to increase the long-term elements of reform and economic stabilization and political stabilization, but in a complicated sphere. And with countries in our neighborhood which are nervous, who are not interested in Ukraine, which is the biggest problem, and for Italians and others.
So we have one more question. So who will be next? Okay. Okay, you can start.
Yeah, Andreas Umland from the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. We know each other. My question follows up in a way what you just said, that obviously the gains for Russia as a state are not high, but the gains for the current regime are high. The support in the opinion polls for Putin is high. The opposition is divided in those who are pro-annexation and anti-annexation. There's a rallying around the flag effect. So for the regime, this has been a successful organization. For Russia, it's bad, and for the long-term prospects of the state. And to that, I think, is connected a defect, as I see it, and I wonder what you think about of Western policies, is that if Ukraine becomes successful, and what you said about the politically stable, economically stable, and the economy rises again, this will then pose a successful Ukraine a direct, I would even say, existential threat to the current Russian regime, because that would then be a countermodel to the Putin system. In a situation where the security question for Ukraine is not solved and Russia remains in militarily overwhelming power. So I think there's a certain trap for Ukraine here. So if Ukraine becomes successful, the effect could be that Russia becomes more aggressive towards Ukraine. And as long as there is no security structure for Ukraine, there's actually, it becomes a, it sounds, absurdly speaking, it might be for Ukraine be better to be unsuccessful, because that would be then less threatening to the Russian regime. And then the Russian regime may not use its military power to prevent a Ukrainian success. I mean, that's now very absurd, sort of, but I think in a way a logical conclusion from that. So I think, the Americans say first things come first. I think Ukraine cannot be successful before the security question is solved in some way, one way or another, by whichever instruments, a new security structure, NATO membership, some treaty, some sort of mechanism that would prevent this from happening. Because I think this is the core of the conflict. It's not about Russia and Ukraine, but it's about this sort of kleptocratic authoritarian regime and countermodel, and at the end of the day, all these Eurasianism and Russian world and all these things, they are secondary. And if Ukraine becomes a counter model, then I think that will trigger a counter reaction in Moscow.
Your analysis is correct in terms of intellectual alternatives. It's not correct when we don't talk about solutions, but about management of problems. And I think we will have many contradictory elements at the same time. And I prefer the problems which are combined with the success of Ukraine to a situation with the failure of Ukraine. So let us deal with the problem. Ukraine is so successful that therefore we have problems in Russia. I prefer those problems compared with the situation if Ukraine is not successful, and therefore we don't have problems with Russia, because even then we would have problems with Russia. So let us try to make it successful. And even when you look at the success, before Ukraine has reached the living standard of Poland, to which it was equal in the early 90s, have reached the levels of Polish gross national product, there will be a couple of years. And let me indirectly already answer a question. Turkey was, in one way or the other, committed to a European Union membership. But when Turkey is going in the wrong direction, this question will be answered in a different way. Whatever people said before. The same is also true for Ukraine and its EU membership. It's totally abstract today to say I'm in favor or I'm against. We have to create a situation in which this situation can be answered in different ways. And when Ukraine would be ready, then many people who now would be against would then be in favor. And if you would have a guarantee today, when you would not be ready, it would not mean, the commitments would mean nothing in the future. So I think this is, again, engage on a process, try to improve in this process your priorities, and then deal with the problems case by case as they come up.
Thank you very much. So I see one more question. Mr. Kokoszynski.
Олег Кокошинский, Atlantic Council of Ukraine, Atlantic Treaty Association. First of all, I'm very thankful that you and Mr. Kavlamers for many times has arrived and represented and supported the position of Ukraine from Parliamentarian Assembly of NATO. And my question is related to the foreign policy. We know that foreign policy is the continuation of the internal policy. And this means the question of a strategic choice of any country could make. And strategic choice of, for instance, for Ukraine, when Mr. Volker Rühe, ex-minister of defense of Germany, was asked, he said, what institution Ukraine should join first, European Union or NATO? And the answer was NATO. And considering that security issues, I fully agree that are priority for Ukraine, especially now. It's fully understandable that we have to decide the future prospect of Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine to NATO. And this was for the first time after Revolution of Dignity, when the majority of the population was for the first time in favor of joining NATO. And even on the eve of Warsaw Summit, it was once again the majority were in favor to join. Unfortunately, the Warsaw Summit has decided, answered the question about to support and to confirm the Bucharest Declaration about the prospects for Ukraine and Georgia. In case of Georgia, it was confirmed. In case of Ukraine, unfortunately, no. And don't you think that such situation gives, considering the role of Ukraine, which really is a fortress of freedom, which already is a part of the security system of the Western world, considering there is a war of civilizational nature between the West in some way and Russia, this means the challenge. So for that reason, there is a need a kind of a Marshall Plan, which is initiated, proposed by Inozemцем from Russia. What is needed to give full support for Ukraine, for such countries like Ukraine, which are requiring and trying to become part of the Western system, part of the Western organization. So this is today for the West is how to decide. Ronald Asmus once said that the West need a new strategy, which is concentrated on the partner countries. And this is today maybe what should be decided and what started to be decided by the Warsaw Summit, that it was an Eastern Front, it was a lot of different programs and options for the partners to contribute. So from this point of view, what do you think that could be answer about the Euro-Atlantic prospects of Ukraine?
No, I would first not agree with your analysis, because the difference is not that we have a war of civilizations between us and Russia, because we have the same authoritarian components in a couple of West European nations. Le Pen, Alternative for Germany, and a couple of other countries where these right-wing populists and some extreme left-wings as well have this policy. But insofar we have this Putin people inside our own country. It's a struggle inside our own country. And it's dominated one in Russia, but it's also, you have them as here as well. You have, I call them the authoritarian international. And they are anti-globalization, trying to solve problems with very simple answers, some social promises, so not neoliberal. So and in German history, they have played a role in earlier times. And that extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing have combined their efforts. We have also seen that in Germany in the 20s. We called it Querfront, because crossing the extreme right and left, and we call it authoritarian, I call it authoritarian international. And therefore, this Putin element is in our own country and not only in other countries. And you might also find it in Ukraine. And the second element, which where you can't compare it, is at the time of the Bucharest summit, a majority of Ukrainians were against NATO membership. And what many people in Ukraine now tend to forget, Ukrainians were not in favor. Your government were in favor, but Ukrainians were not in favor. And I feared at that time that the issue of NATO membership would split your country, politically and part also geographically, because many people have not only negative memories about the Great Patriotic War. You have different historical memories in your country about the Great Patriotic War. There's a different memory in Western Ukraine and in other parts of Ukraine, which I understand. And if you had taken up the issue of NATO membership in a period where, of that time, I think it could have split the country. EU membership was not controversial. And it was at that time not even controversial with Russia, because Russia was as well a close cooperation with the European Union. So it was not controversial with Russia, and it was not controversial to that degree inside Ukraine. And so far I thought that this should come first, and then the question was how far you can reform. And we are now in a strange situation that you want to reform, and with the help of outside interference by the IMF, by the World Bank, you hope to control some of your oligarchs, which you, as a result of your own domestic correlation of forces, cannot control alone. So we have a strange interplay that those who really want reform need outside partners, because inside partners are not strong enough to do this business alone. So it's again an interplay between international actors and national actors, what the Russians would call colored revolutions also. Did I forget something?
So, next one.
Mr. Karsten, thank you so much for a very interesting and many-sided report, and would ask you some very special question from the psychological point of view. I'm a PhD psychologist from the Department of Psychodiagnostic and Clinical Psychology, Kyiv National Trust Shevchenko University, and I greatly think that there's much common politics and psychology. So, and you explain us how it is really important to take into account psychological peculiarities of politicians. A very special question will be about the meeting of Michael Gorbachev. You twicely mentioned the role of Michael Gorbachev in the history of former Soviet Union. If I'm not mistaken, Michael Gorbachev had a special meeting with former President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, in Geneva. And once upon a time, former American president said the following words. Soviet Union is really devil country, demon country. How will you comment his comments? Thank you so much for understanding.
I would never use this terminology that they are demons. I was dealing with concrete people. And I was dealing in, when I was going to the Soviet Union, I was at that time chairman of the German-Soviet parliamentary group. I was been over 60 times in my life in Moscow. And I had to deal with concrete people, not with demons. And I mean, when I first came to the Soviet Union, and when I first came to Crimea in 1970, the Second World War was closer than now the fall of the wall is. We are now further away from the fall of the wall than at that time, 1970, from the end of World War II. At that time, I met people who had suffered under World War II. And they feared that something might happen again. And they had a very different picture of history than I had. I studied German occupational history in Denmark. I was at Denmark at the institute as a German, at the Danish Institute for Occupational History. So I wanted to study how other countries who were occupied were looking on Germany. And every time when something negative was reported in the lecture, everybody was looking at me how I reacted. So that generation in the Soviet Union they were still believing in the ideas that changed later on. But many of them believed it still. I would not talk about demons. And Gorbachev, when I met him first, believed that if he would modernize communism, that communism would be more efficient than capitalism. The first meeting which I had together with Willy Brandt in the Kremlin, he was Martin Luther. He didn't want to split the church, but he wanted to reform the church. And so he was a convinced Leninist, interesting enough. And many Russians of that time, even the reformers under Gorbachev, were Leninists. And they believed in the Russian rule. And then for many Russians to lose the Soviet Union, which was their identity, is a loss. It reminds me on the psychology of Germany after the Versailles situation. They saw the democracy as being imposed on them to weaken Russia. And they thought that this was a plan, a conspiracy against Russia. And why do I understand it? I mean, not saying that the end of Cold War II, of the Cold War was identical with that. I'm comparing it. I'm not saying it's identical. Forgive me, I'm not misinterpreting it. But it took decades before the Germans understood that they needed to be defeated to be liberated. After 45. My school teachers in 45, no, 45 I didn't go to school, but in 55, were former Nazis. And they were now all Democrats, quote unquote. but they had not forgotten all of their old ideas. It took us decades to change. And therefore, with all negative description of the Russians as they are today, I would never say that the Russians can't change. And I would never demonize an opponent. I would say he is complicated, he is difficult, I'm hostile to his views, I protect myself against his methods. But I have lived through a period in my life when everybody thought Germans can't change. That's my experience in my lifetime as a youngster. How can I say that Russians can't change? So I'm try to be realistically and say they are not there yet. They are a problem. But I would never accept a view in which one would say Russians by nature cannot become democratic. It might take a couple of decades, can take 200 years. No, I mean, how can I predict it? But I would never say human beings by nature cannot change. I would say they can change. And we have to create conditions. Did you believe that you would have such a Ukraine as you have today when you was young? Are there not many of the older people who were convinced communists who nowadays are very active in the building up of a democracy? You have problems with them. So people can change. I would not make such a negative assessment about the nature. Because I'm not negative on the future, it doesn't mean that I try to be unrealistic insofar as the present time is concerned. But I would never say empire of evil, as Reagan said. Simplification was more complicated. Even the GDR was, for example, compared with Stalin, the GDR was much milder. In the 50s it was Stalin, but later on the GDR was, what did they do? They expelled dissidents. In the 50s, they put them to Vorkuta. So there is a difference. Even dictatorships can be different. I hope it's not too optimistic.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for more questions. And as far as I see at the moment, audience is silent. I have one question to you, because during our discussions in Kyiv, for many times, we touched the issue, why is Russia angry with NATO? And we had some diplomats stating that they have very clear information that when there was collapse, reunification of Germany, so Russia's got a message from NATO that if it lets Germany to be united, so there will be no movement of NATO to east. And now Russia is very angry of what was happening, and so that's why it entered Ukraine. So this is what some old diplomats used to say. So, and I know you have very great experience in answering that issue, so I believe for audience it would be very interesting.
I went to Moscow in early 1990 on a delegation to discuss NATO membership of Unite Germany. I met Shevardnadze and Yakovlev together with Egon Bahr, and a couple of other, Farlin and all the others. And before that, I was in the National Security Council in Washington, and we discussed NATO membership of Unite Germany at that time. And they tried to convince me that the Russians would finally, Soviets at that time, would finally accept membership of United Germany inside NATO. So I went to Moscow, and when I left Moscow, I was more convinced than before that in the final end, the Soviets would accept NATO membership of United Germany. So what is the debate about? The debate is about that in early January, February, March 1990, it was about the status, military status of a united Germany. Warsaw Pact still existed. Poland wanted to stay at that time the Warsaw Pact because they feared the Germans. Many people tend to forget that. And then in that context, not formally but informal in dialogue, two leading Western politicians, Baker, foreign minister of the US, and Genscher, foreign minister in Germany, argued in favor of German membership in NATO, of a united Germany in NATO, and said, if you accept that, we could think about guaranteeing not to enlarge NATO beyond that. The Russians rejected, the Soviets rejected that because they were at that time against NATO membership of United Germany. And they never repeated it. It was never formalized, this offer, but they never repeated it because they, in the early 1990s, they were in favor of membership of United Germany. And later on, they accepted it. But in this context, they didn't even ask for a commitment. And not, it was never formalized, but it was never asked by them. So if they could blame something, they could blame Gorbachev and others. And why was it not asked by them? Because at that time, Gorbachev had the view that every country should make its own decision about how it will organize its security. That's what is inside the Charter of Paris. And then it would have been illogical to say, but I demand that NATO would not be enlarged. So in the first phase, it was an informal statement by two people in the context of the German military status, which was rejected by the Russians. Later on, the Russians did not ask for it, did not repeat it, did not get any commitment, and Germany was united with the 2+4 agreement without any such commitment written down or verbally expressed.
Thank you very much. So we have some more time for several questions. Yes, I see two persons. So first you, and then coming back.
She is, no. She asked for it.
Елена, литовская компания «Ровес», хотела бы попросить Тараса, чтобы перевел мой вопрос. Заявление президента Германии Йохима Гаука о том, что на пути к великому объединению власти Евросоюза было очень быстрыми, поэтому нам необходимо взять паузу и подумать о том, какие цели стоят перед нами и в каком темпе будем мы двигаться дальше. Это сегодняшнее было заявление.
Кто это сказал?
Президент Германии Joachim Gauck.
President of Germany today announced that they need to think about further EU enlargement and to make a pause and to think about what to do next. So you know about this statement, yeah?
И вот относительно этой речи буквально два вопроса. Многие ли чиновники Евросоюза считают так же, и стоит ли опасаться данной паузы, во время которой Россия сможет усилить свои позиции, или это всего лишь громкие заявления в преддверии парламентских выборов в Германии?
So what do you think about that? Do many European bureaucrats think the same way and should be afraid of this pause while Russia will increase its strength during this pause? And so what does it mean? This is just political statement before elections, or what?
It is, I remember a situation in early 1990 when I had a meeting with the French socialists about German unification. And they said, we will accept that the GDR becomes member of the European Union. We, French support, would prefer a separate GDR and not a united Germany, but we will accept it. But we always understood that you were in favor of a pan-European role of the European Union because you meant German unification. Now you get it. Can you give us a guarantee that you will not enlarge beyond GDR? So it was always difficult to enlarge the European Union. There were many who opposed the Spanish membership, others were against the Swedish membership, and so it was always difficult. And always those people in the European Union sitting in Brussels were skeptical about enlarging the European Union, for good reasons. Because it's the management of 28 is much more difficult than the management of 6 or 9. And therefore, you will always find people in the European Union who will oppose an enlargement process. I always was jokingly saying Warsaw Pact is now a long history, but I always said in the European Union it's difficult to get in NATO it was difficult to get in, the Warsaw Pact it was difficult to get out. So I'm simply saying it will be a battle before you accept. Many people would in the European Union were against this association treaty. Many people were against this Eastern Partnership concept. And with contradictions, you will even get a visa-free regime. It only takes longer, people will oppose. And so this is how it is. It's a battle to come closer to Europe because the people like one another, they're used to one another, you're disturbing this. And when you are with the association treaty, you are now already closer than many other countries. So it will be a battle. Whatever they are saying, those in Brussels are skeptical. And then you have to find allies inside the European Union. And then you have to mobilize them. It's an ongoing process. And this will never end.
Thank you very much. Well, now it's your turn.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Terras and Mr. Carsten. My next question will be very short. And again, thank you so much for your inspiring, relaxing atmosphere. It's very interesting for us. And my next question will be about your attitude, to my mind. Another important person visited Ukraine, State Secretary of the United States, Joe Biden and Kerry. And if I'm not mistaken, there was very interesting comments by Kerry. He visited Kiev just in the big memory day when first 100 people, Ukrainians, were badly shot by internal forces. And I'm trying to remember his very interesting words. It was simply reported by Ukrainian media. A representative of our internal security forces and diplomats from the representative of the United States diplomacy services organized very special Let It Be sightseeing tour across the central street, Khrushchev Street, where really first 100 people were shot by internal forces. And he simply addressed, just for the passerbys, you are Ukrainians, you are really courageous people. I think that you will win. First question. And second, short questions. What do you think about very interesting report delivered by Joe Biden in the Supreme Soviet in Ukraine? Have you ever seen, raise up hands, really ever seen Joe Biden report for the representative of Supreme Soviet from the position of West German Poland? Thank you so much.
I don't know
Thank you.
the Supreme Soviet, I can only know the Verkhovna Rada. Yeah, I know, but it's... I don't know that one.
And Judge Kerry, Ukrainians are really courageous people.
Yeah. I mean, Bertolt Brecht, the famous writer in Germany, said, I have a pity feeling for those countries who need brave people. What I'm saying is, you need still brave people, which shows how difficult your situation is. I prefer a situation in which we no longer need brave people. I mean, need brave, if you have a functioning economy and a functioning democracy, you only need normal people. You still need brave people who fight the corruption, who ask for economic reforms, who are in favor of clearing up the system. And that means, on one side, I say Biden is correct, Kerry is correct, but on the other side, I would also say to be brave for 1 year is easy, but to be brave for 30 years, that's difficult. And this is, I mean, those people who started with the Maidan, you promised them to fight for that idea forever. Many people have given up. So that's the normal situation. And while I admire many of these people, the long engagement, long-time engagement, that is what you need and what we need as well.
Thank you very much. And as our meeting is close to end, and I see that our senior audience is very active and young audience is very shy, so we are expected to hear something from our young people as representing future generation. And can I have a question to you? Because you can answer in Ukrainian. If you need, I will make translation. So the question is, you know the situation around, you know position of Germany, and if you were Germans, so what would you do in present situation? What would you be, your policy, etc.? So I can repeat in Ukrainian. Виходячи з теперішньої ситуації безпеки, це запитання до молодої аудиторії, чи тих, хто відчуває себе молодим. Що би ви робили на місці Німеччини, німецького уряду? От, які кроки ви вважаєте, Німеччина мала би робити сьогодні? So you can think several seconds and give answer. Just raise your hands. It can be very short. So?
Then I might give an answer. What is the most difficult challenge for Germany? It's not the security issue. We need to redefine our identity. When I was young and I would have met somebody black, I would always have spoken to him in English. Now I give a try in German. When you compare the center of German cities with the center of German cities 40 years ago, they are multicultural. And this means that our identity is changing. When you go in the center of Berlin and Frankfurt, many Ukrainians there going there would not have the feelings as if they are foreigners there, because there are so many nations. And this is one element of the attraction of Berlin, by the way, that you have all these young people from all parts of Europe and living there. So that's the positive side. But naturally, many people, elder people, have problems with that. And naturally, it has also problems about competition, about housing, about jobs, and so on. And how we define this new Germany, this new German identity, which is hybrid. I'm a German, I'm a European, I'm sometimes an intellectual, I'm a politician, I'm a social democrat. And so I have a lot of these identities. And some of these identities I have in common with those who come now as new Germans. And I'm meeting them as all Germans. And how we deal with it. There's a refugee, when I say it, we took last year 1 million refugees. But what nobody is telling, we took after 89 between 2 and 3 million people from the former Soviet Union. The largest immigration group in Germany were the Turks. They are still there. But of the newcomers after 1990, the largest groups were the Poles. In the last years, we got more Romanians than Poles. And people from Bulgaria are growing, and Hungary. So it's because of the internal movement of people, and Ukrainians will come. And it's because of the internal movement of people at the universities, deliberately, we ask them to come. And in the streets, we have mixed identities. And this is difficult. It's easy to speak about it, but it's difficult. We will not totally succeed. But if we succeed to manage that, it means that German will be attractive for young people from all over Europe. If we succeed. We have had very little violence in Germany, unlike France. And we have a lot of people fighting this process, but all statistics elements are showing that the majority of people are supporting this, unlike in other European countries. And this means that we are in Eastern Germany, because they have less experience with migration, they had the opposite experience of people trying to leave. Therefore, they have more resistance coming from there. So this process, which I call a certain degree of Europeanization of German society, Syrians are only one element. This is something which is challenging, and this has to do with domestic policy, but it's also changing the German role inside Europe. And it changes the outlook of Germans on their environment. And I think this is, I'm observing it, I'm living in such a part of the city where I'm seeing it. And this is for those who have been in Berlin in these days or in Frankfurt, they see it. And they see the problems, but they see also how vibrant it is. And this is a very interesting process. I only hope that you once will visit it. It's full of problems, full of challenges, but it means that Germany's role is also redefined by redefining German identity.
Thank you very much. So is anybody willing to say about Germany? Yes, I see one hand.
Good evening. As a representative of young people today, I want to ask you one question. It will be very short, but it's not about Ukraine, it's not about Russia. I want to ask you about the Germany position and maybe NATO position about international security and about Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, how they call itself. I want to ask you which actions Germany can make and will make, and which actions NATO can make more to stop this aggression, to stop these explosions which are happening every day.
The first element of it is a domestic one. We have to prevent that those who have an Islamic background become those radicals inside our society. And this means we have to, we have now the first theological faculties in Islamic theology at German state universities, where we try to educate imams so that the imams are not only educated in Turkey and in Saudi Arabia. We need so to educate them. And then we need dialogue with those people inside our society and so on. And we need the help of Muslim people to get hold of the terrorists, because the terrorists don't have the support of the overwhelming majority of the Muslim people. So it's a domestic element. There is it's an intelligence element, it's police element, but there's also a cultural element. And then we have the external element. The external element is, for example, that for the first time, German armed forces are training Kurdish people in northern Iraq, which I never thought would happen, and training them so that they can fight against the ISIS, Daesh. We have the person in Libya who on behalf of the United Nations is trying to manage that Libyans again get a government, is Kobler, a German diplomat. We have in Mali, which was earlier French territory, where I thought they never would have. The French now want German assistance, and we have now German military advisors and police forces in Mali to prevent, so to say, the terrorism coming further to the north. We have offshore Somalia. We have, together with other nations, anti-pirate mission, Navy mission, which tries to prevent that they get money and then have terrorist organization in Somalia and in Kenya. So there is this culture element, which I would not underestimate. There is this domestic element, which is where culture has a foreign element, has a domestic element. There is a police element, there's a military element. And I think this is, it's a totally new threat. What we can't accept, and this again has with Russia, that so to say, Daesh, they fight in the name of fighting against terrorism, they support Assad, and they are not fighting ISIS, Daesh. That we can't accept. This is another problem which we have with Russia. But the fight against Daesh has a cultural element. Never forget that cultural element. It says how we deal with it in our societies, how they are in the schools. And then it has a foreign policy element and has a military and an intelligence element. And this makes it complex. And again, it's one of the new challenges which we face.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fogt. So our meeting is coming to the end, and traditionally we are asking our guests to provide this message to inspire our audience. So the question is, what do you believe is important for your personal life, for your career?
My career has
To
ended.
make it successful, yeah. Yeah.
I think what is very important, I mean, you have many choices in your life. Either you want to become something or you want to be somebody. Some people are sacrificing all of their life in view of the hopes that they in one time at the later stage become very prominent or a chancellor or something like that. But they don't have a fully, that's not my fulfillment. My fulfillment was always, my idea was always to be something at any stage, at all stages. So that I, in each stage of my life, could identify myself with the work which I'm doing. And now, after I've left active policies, for me it's a pleasure that active politicians don't see my ongoing debate, participation in the debate about foreign policy issues as an infringement of their interest, but they see it as something which is helping them because they naturally are more innovative than I am, but I have more experience than they have. And on the other side, I can speak. I am no longer in parliament, I'm no longer in government, so I speak freer. I have the time to read books, to write articles, and thereby defining long-term perspectives and not only short-term tactical moves. When you can do that at the age of 75, that's my age, you can do that at the age of 75 and are not sounding totally stupid and can participate in the intellectual debate about these issues on board of a couple of think tanks. What can be better? I mean, this is the fulfillment of the life, and if you have such a life with all complications, I wish you well.
Thank you very much for your participation. So please stay in touch with us, watch our announcements, and looking forward to see you next time here.